you state basically that Britain was never very pro-European, though in 1970s 2/3 of the people they voted to stay in. So in these decades, what do you think changed basically in this British perspective?
So it's not that Britain was never pro-European. Actually, for a brief period in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there were heavy majorities in favour of Britain staying in the European Union. In fact, Britain was highly European during this period. The real difference is that Britain has always been relatively more Eurosceptic than any other European Union member state. So in the 1970s, when all of the European Union was fairly Eurosceptic for a period, Britain was 20 to 30 points less pro-European. Then, as opinion went upward throughout the 1980s, Britain followed, but 20 percentage points lower. And then as opinion's gone down across the European Union through the 1990s and the 2000s, Britain also went down with the European Union, but 20 to 30% lower, which meant that by 2016, it just reached a point where there was a majority in favour of leaving for the first time in some time. Why? So that really points to two issues. One, why is Britain relatively more Eurosceptic than any other country in the European Union? And two, why did this change over time, as you already pointed out? Why Britain is a more Eurosceptic country than other European Union member states, we argue, or I have argued in recent work, is the result of really history, culture and geography. And so obviously Britain is an island, but Britain also has closer links with other countries around the world, historically, linguistically, familiarly. So Britain doesn't really see each other and never doesn't see itself and never really has as a truly European country. Now there's really 4 cross-time issues for why pro-Europeanism has declined in the UK. The first one started in the early 1990s, where there was 2 crises in a very short amount of time. The first was the ERM crisis, the exchange rate mechanism, where Britain ended up losing £4 billion. It vindicated Eurosceptics in the UK. It highlighted the lack of monetary synchrony with Germany. Then there was the Maastricht Treaty, which aimed to create the European Union out of European communities before then. And that really mobilised the Eurosceptics, which were already latent in the UK. More recently, more famously, there's been large-scale immigration since 2004, again mobilising the working class who have generally always been opposed to European integration anyway. And then finally, the Eurozone crisis, which really undermined the intellectual credibility of the project in the eyes of Britain.
Do you think that economically then, European Union, being a member of European Union meant benefit for Great Britain? And can we actually measure this now, like what is going to happen economically to Great Britain when it leaves?
So I think it's hard for me or probably anyone to say what will happen now. I think the general consensus is that European integration has been good for the UK economically, and Britain's trade indeed has shifted towards European countries. Regarding Brexit though, 2 things really happened which sort of shifted that narrative. So in the late 1980s, 3 of the largest economies on earth were France, Germany and Italy. And in the time since then, those have declined in relative importance. Then that has been accelerated with the Eurozone crisis, which has really given the latent Eurosceptics in the UK, which as I argue have always been there, greater ammunition to say we need to move away from Europe, we need to trade with the rest of the world, which is really what they were saying in 1975 as well, but was far less convincing then because there were all of these strong economies in Western Europe at the time. So if you're a Eurosceptic, you would say that, of course, Brexit will be excellent for the British economy. We can make our own trade deals. Europe's dying anyway. They have this currency which doesn't work. So we can become a very flexible, singular negotiating and trading partner with countries in every corner of the world. If you're a pro-European, you'd say this is going to be a disaster because still half of our trade is with Europe, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. So really, I think no one can say for sure what will happen.
This brings us to a very important issue, I think. If if I'm not mistaken, Richard Branson told that the referendum should be repeated, this time basing it on real facts. He said it so. Do you think that this was important in Great Britain, that somehow the decision of the voters went against facts?
I am rather sceptical of that point of view. I don't think that voters were really particularly influenced by the campaign at all, in fact, whether the campaign was based on facts or not. Most people had already made up their minds on the European Union. And that's because in the 20 to 30 years prior to the referendum, the European Union had really been in the British media almost every day, often in a negative light. So most people had become pro or anti-European, essentially whether they're conservative or liberal to some extent, or left-wing or right-wing, however you want to label it to some extent. So statistically, we can show that most people had already made up their minds. Furthermore, throughout the campaign, the polls didn't change that much. So it doesn't look like the campaign made that much of an effect. The other issue is that the press were highly pro-European prior to the 1990s, yet Britain was still relatively Eurosceptic during that period. So what it really points to is that the press and the campaigns didn't make that much of a difference. People already had strong prior convictions on the topic of Europe, which, as I say, had been in the British mainstream discussed almost daily throughout the last 20 to 30 years.
Which basically means that if I am pro-EU or anti-EU, I just find facts that prove my...
That's exactly right. And that really points to another piece of evidence that we've shown, which is that attitudes to European integration and towards Brexit were, as we say, unidimensional, which means that if you think that European Union membership is good for Britain's economy, then you also think it's good for Britain's, let's say, diplomatic power. You also think it's good for social reasons. You think it's good for everything. If you think it's bad for one of these things, for the economy, for immigration, you think it's bad for all of these things. It points to the fact that people are making a so-called rational calculation or a cost-benefit calculation here. They have attitudes that are political and non-political. And really, the attitudes to Europe are, by 2016, certainly, and actually probably for some time earlier, were already fairly well formed.
So basically, it's not a rational calculation. It's more of a preconceived identity thing, right?
Exactly.
What are the components then of this identity? You spoke about historical and cultural influence. So let's go a bit deeper into it.
Some of the determinants are pretty clear. If you voted Leave, you were more likely to be older, you were more likely to not have a university degree, you were likely to live in certain areas, particularly not in London, particularly not in Scotland. And you were particularly likely to have certain types of jobs, such as white-collar jobs, let's say. So really we can see that a certain type of lifestyle, a certain type of socialization, let's say, leads you to have certain attitudes on the question of Europe and on politics more generally. And that being presented with certain Eurosceptic news, if you're one of these, let's say, degree-educated people, if you're presented with something from Nigel Farage, one of the Eurosceptics in the UK, you're going to immediately reject it because you're not creating a calculation. You already have your attitude in place. So I think to answer your original question, we know that education is a major determinant of attitudes to Europe and other attitudes in general, as are things like your work, as are things like your income to a far lesser extent. Age is very important. The young tend to be pro-European. So really it's your life experience that affects your attitudes.
Take back control. There was a slogan in the anti-EU campaign, sovereignty of the people. Do you think Britain ever lost control? Do you think Britain lost sovereignty? What's your stance on it?
Well, I think this is more of a legal question, but again, it comes down to attitudes to a large extent. I would say, even amongst academics, on the one hand, you could say Britain's sovereignty was just the fact we were able to leave shows that we were sovereign all along. You could also say our sovereignty was somehow enhanced by being able to influence law across a continent. On the other hand, of course, they were able to influence our law, so our sovereignty was lost in that respect. So really, I think this question is going to fall back on attitudes and where there are objective accounts of whether sovereignty was lost or gained. I think that's more a question for the legal scholars than it would be for social scientists such as myself.
As a social scientist, then, what has been a discovery of the year while analyzing this process, while analyzing this wave? Something maybe very particularly British, something I think it was Ibsen who said that you need to leave your country to really understand it. Now you live in Florence, you analyze Britain from there. Something that you discovered, understood about your own country.
Certainly one thing that is clear to me, going back to the EU referendum, is the sense of Europeanness. And in somewhere like Italy, and especially in somewhere like France and Germany, they really, to some extent, or a significant proportion of the population, feel European. In Britain, we don't. And even the pro-Europeans, i.e. the people who voted to remain, they are European in a rather practical sense and a non-identitarian sense. So this really reflects the gulf between the two. For Britain, the European Union membership was pragmatic. It was about joining an economic success story. It was about reaping the rewards as best we could and influencing things as our image of ourselves dictates as a country that influences the world. Whether that's still the case or not will remain to be seen. For continental Europeans, I think it really is rather different, that people feel European. They want to unite for the sake of, or some I should say, want to unite for the sake of unification rather than for the sake of money or power, let's say.
For a lot of Eastern Europeans, the history, or at least the last few hundred of years, is basically eternal effort to prove that we are part of Europe, that we are part of West. Do you mean that then, in this term, a British identity is self-sufficient?
Certainly, I wouldn't say self-sufficient in any respect. And in fact, you see that there are many Britons who don't even feel a British sense of identity, particularly in Scotland and some in Wales and Northern Ireland. What I think, the point you bring up, which is really relevant, is how a country defines itself is partially how it is defined by who it sees as its other and its biggest threat. So for a country like Lithuania, it's rather clear that the biggest threat would be Russia. For a country like Greece, it could be Turkey. Or also for a lot of the southern or eastern European countries, the threat could be somehow moving away from the West and declining economically and becoming less modern. For Ireland, the threat was always Britain. But for Britain, the big threat always came from Europe. So the Germans, the French, the Spanish before them. Britain's sense of the other has not been something extra-European, or it's really been this idea of something coming from the continent. So if we talk about history, and we compare Britain with Lithuania, for example, Europe is the salvation for Lithuania, modern, non-Russian. Whereas for Britain, Europe is a threat both historically in military terms, and probably a little bit of a threat to our sense of a slightly arrogant sense of our place in the world. After all, France and Germany are just as strong as us economically, or stronger, and may soon be far more powerful internationally as well. So we were never quite comfortable with having to share power with countries that we saw as not as significant as ourselves globally. Unfortunately, as we're about to find out, that wasn't quite as accurate as we might have hoped.
So for certain hundreds of thousands of Lithuanians coming to Great Britain is also a kind of a threat to the homogeneity of identity.
Immigration certainly played a role in Britain leaving the European Union. After all, attitudes to immigration and attitudes to Europe became highly correlated in the 20 years prior to Brexit. So in the year 2000, someone could be pro-European and anti-immigration, or pro-immigration and anti-European. This really changed by 2016. The two became one attitude. If you're pro-European, you're pro-immigration, and vice versa. What I think immigration really did then is it took an issue like Europe, which, as I say, particularly certain demographics, let's say working class for want of a better phrase, were always opposed to. And it made it highly salient, because suddenly Europe was not about abstract notions of constitutionality or international power, or even economics. It was about your neighbour. And this was far more material, this is far more visible than European unification before. And then we need to bear in mind that the UK didn't join the Euro, wasn't in Schengen, wasn't in the Charter of Fundamental Rights or Freedom, Security and Justice. And that means that really for Britain, Europe, what was left? The four freedoms, which meant that Europe was immigration. And of course, as I say, there are a large portion of the electorate who have latent attitudes opposed to, as you say, heterogeneity. They would prefer a homogeneous and ethnically or culturally homogeneous country. The one aside I would say to that is that the proportion of Britain's population who are EU migrants is lower than the equivalent proportion in Germany, France, Sweden or Spain. Yet in Britain it seems to be an especially controversial topic. And the reason for that is because we already had latent anti-European attitudes anyway. So that's where it comes back to the point you were saying. Immigration didn't help, but it was really immigration combined with this latent anti-Europeanism.
After Prime Minister May triggers the Brexit next week, do you see any general fear in Great Britain that this would also trigger, now when Scotland is considering the second referendum for independence, this would also trigger some kind of, I don't know how to put it, a localization, like this collapse of a Britishness in the British identity. Now we've been talking about Britain wishing to remain British or to somehow separate from continental Europe. But this could also trigger different kind of borders inside the island.
That's right, and this is clearly a highly salient and potentially dramatic trend we're seeing. When it comes to Scottish nationalism, though, that's really a long-term issue. Again, maybe not quite as long-term as Euroscepticism, but a similar time span. Scottish nationalism has been increasing for 30, 40 years or more. And by 2014, when there was a Scottish independence referendum, we saw that by the end of that campaign, there were really two camps, pro-independence or pro-union. Now, why I'm rather sceptical that Scotland might leave the United Kingdom in the short term is that those opinions are already fairly well formed. A future campaign is unlikely to affect them much now. Also, there are certain economic arguments such as that Britain won't be in the single market now, the rest of the UK won't be in the single market, so it won't be such an easy transition if Scotland then seeks to join the European single market. On the other hand, that socialisation that happened during the last independence referendum created a whole generation of young Scots who were pro-independence. And as the older Scots die out and more young Scots who presumably will be pro-independence as well come in the medium term, 20, 30 years from now, maybe even less, 10, 20 years from now, there probably will be a large pro-independence majority. So in the short term, the next few years, I doubt there'll be independence for Scotland. But in the medium term, unless there is some kind of dramatic change, then we should expect to see a large majority in Scotland in favour of independence.
So you think it's a matter of time, basically?
I don't think it's a matter of time because events can change things. People's attitudes are malleable, but it takes either long-term change or it takes shocks. One of the shocks could be, who knows what will happen with the European Union. It could also be that we see that Britain actually does okay out of Brexit. It could also be that it becomes increasingly clear that now Scotland has to choose between the rest of the UK and the EU. That's a rather different choice than before when it would be in the EU regardless in 2014. So I wouldn't like to say anything certain, but the trend is certainly that we're going towards a Scottish majority on current, according to current trends.